who is Melchizedek in Genesis 14? And Melchizedek is a really interesting, fascinating character. And I have to give a lot of my understanding of Melchizedek, give credit of that to my friend Ellis Coleman, who did his undergraduate dissertation on Melchizedek. And it was one of the best dissertations I've ever read, undergraduate dissertations. And so I just wanted to give him credit for that, because most of my understanding comes from him. But we read of Melchizedek in Genesis 14. And in Genesis 14, Abraham, his nephew Lot, has gone and got himself in trouble. And so Abraham has had to wage war with a number of kings to rescue his brother Lot. And there's a number of kings involved in this fight. There's Abraham and a few kings, and then there is the bad guys, a collection of kings and bad guys. And so we get in Ezekiel, after the battle, it says this: "And Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine. He was priest of God Most High. And he blessed him and said, Blessed be Abraham by God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth, and blessed be God Most High, who has delivered your enemies into your hand." And then that's all we get in Genesis 14. We don't really get any more explanation than that. And I liken Melchizedek to Tom Bombadil in the Lord of the Rings trilogy. If you read the books, you'll know that there's a character that kind of seems to just pop out of nowhere called Tom Bombadil. And it's very clear that Tom Bombadil is powerful and important, but he's also just completely disconnected to everything else that's happening in the story, and disconnected from seemingly the world around him. And then he just disappears again. And we don't really, at least in the trilogy, get any real explanation of who he is or why he was there. And that really is Melchizedek. He kind of pops in, he's clearly important, does some stuff, and then he leaves with no explanation of why. And there are a few things that we can learn from this Genesis 14 passage. So we know that he was the king of Salem. Now, Salem was the early name of Jerusalem before kind of Israel had taken it and laid claim to it. And so he's a king of Jerusalem. He's also a priest of God Most High. And this puts him in a really interesting category that he's a king and he's a priest, which is imagery that we're going to see brought up elsewhere in the Bible. He's also interesting because he's one of the few legitimate, if only, actually maybe the only legitimate priest we see who's not from the tribe of Levi. So when we get further down into the story and Israel has become a nation, it's the tribe of Levi that all of the priests come from. And yet here we've got a priest who's not from the tribe of Levi. And so we've got a king who's also a priest who's not from the tribe of Levi. And so we start to get people using this imagery and pointing it to what will eventually be the Messiah. And so still in the Old Testament, we have Psalm 110 verse 4, where we see, "The Lord has sworn and will not change his mind. You are a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek." And so this psalmist is prophesying of a future king, of a future Messiah who will save the people. And he describes him as a priest of the order of Melchizedek. He's a priest that isn't from the tribe of Levi. And then that's it. That's all we get of mention in the Old Testament of Melchizedek. But then what's interesting is there's lots of writings in the intertestamental period, which is the bit in between the Old Testament and the New Testament. And in these writings, these authors are kind of working through and thinking through a lot of the ideas in the Old Testament and trying to understand them. And Melchizedek keeps coming up and keeps being used as an almost Messiah-like figure. So some stories have him being born from immaculate conception. But most importantly, he's associated with bringing God's judgment and atonement and freedom and overcoming the forces of spiritual darkness. Which is then understandable why when you get to the New Testament, Melchizedek is almost meant to be foreshadowing Jesus. That Jesus comes, he's a king, he's a priest, not from the tribe of Levi. He was immaculately conceived, and he comes to bring God's judgment, but also atonement and freedom, overcoming the forces of spiritual darkness. And the main place that this really gets picked up in the New Testament is Hebrews. In the book of Hebrews, there's a whole chapter, Hebrews 7, on Melchizedek, comparing Jesus to Melchizedek, saying, hey, he is a priest like Melchizedek that is greater. And so some people then go, well, does that mean Melchizedek was an early Jesus? that Jesus kind of, before he became Jesus, the Son of God, the Son in the trilogy kind of came down in the form of Melchizedek. Potentially, the Bible doesn't say that, we don't know. What's important is to get a sense of that he is like what we know as a type. And so we get various different images, various different people in the Old Testament that foreshadow something that's going to come in Jesus. And Melchizedek serves that role of being a king, being a priest, and that through him, it got people thinking, it got people kind of wrestling through ideas, and then he kind of becomes this kind of prototype in the minds of people, not in the Bible specifically, but in the minds of people, of what would eventually become Jesus. And so that is Melchizedek. I hope you found that helpful. Let me know if you agree or disagree in the comments below. This was a snippet of a much larger conversation, which you can find here, or you can get plugged in with our Bible in a Year commentary just there. Otherwise, I hope to see you in the next video.